Hello everybody, I'm a little bit behind schedule, so I'm actually going to set things up as I introduce the video. Obviously this is ideally going to be the penultimate part of a series of live responses I've been doing to somebody who made a response video to me a few years ago. I've now reached a point where because I'm towards the end, I'm setting myself specific goals of what I want to actually achieve. Speaking of goals and the like, I'm a little bit off today because one, I have a tiny bit of a sore throat, and having that sore throat is an extension of having been ill, more ill, over the last week. And that completely threw off my schedule for everything. Oh god, another thing, just very quickly. I'm going to be going to Cornwall in 2 weeks, and I will be there for a week. So I don't really know what I'm going to do there in terms of these live reaction things. What I think I might do is just skip one, because I've always kind of, like, my general assumption has been that most of you are here because you just wanted to contribute, and this is like a little bonus extra thing. So I imagine that, because otherwise I kind of have to, you know, I mean, it's not like the hardest thing in the world to do this, but I'd have to find another couple of hours more than a couple of hours actually, because there's recording, of course, and then there's also editing. Just over a couple of hours to make an extra video so that I could have that ready to upload. You get what I'm saying. Anyway, so with that said, though, I should still be able to get this video done and then next video done before I go. So that is good, and I am now actually ready to jump into the video. You can see that I've been watching things at double speed. That's all out. Alright, and let's jump into it.
One day they may feel like wearing a dress, another day they might want to wear a suit, yet another day they might wear a suit but also makeup. This is clearly not in any way undermining the fact that other people may strive to do something similar. For example, a cis man might want to start wearing makeup.
Well, it is undermining it because so we're on kind of non-binary, that's the topic we're on, and obviously if you're saying I am gender fluid because I, am basically gender non-conforming, the problem is, well, why does that make you different from the very, very many people who are gender non-conforming in all sorts of ways that would not call themselves gender fluid? It's this issue of coming up with a word to describe how unique you are about something that is in fact not unique. That's the issue of calling yourself gender fluid.
And it would mean that they likely sometimes want to be treated like average members of the male sex want to be treated. Maybe sometimes like average members of the female sex want to be treated. Okay,
so the only thing I'll say here is we've already kind of gone through this whole, these people want to be treated the way an average member of the male or female sex wants to be treated. I've already explained how I think there's an issue there. The basic summary of the issue is that either you relate that to basically social roles and, kind of the way you're treated more generally, in which case you're then talking about kind of sex stereotypes and very much relating it to gender, which would make his whole point here, which is he's kind of saying, well, there's a difference between gender expression and gender identity. Well, if it's about how you want to be treated, that's not really true. But the alternative is you could just say, well, he just means it's about how you want to be treated in terms of how you want to be called. But then that's essentially just, saying a woman is someone who identifies as a woman with extra steps. Now, taking all of that, if you then add the idea of gender fluidity, which is basically that somebody might want to be treated varying degrees of how male and female want to be treated, and even be treated in categories completely beyond that binary. And this is variable from day to day, hour to hour, minute to minute. You are adding even more complexity to something that already is so kind of complex that it seems basically nonsensical.
But the whole point is that this is very unlikely to be the case. Instead, most people will have these feelings to a lesser degree, or just in relation to gender expression. And
well, look, how do you know that? Right, the only thing you got is what people are saying. Is it not equally likely that there's people who have these feelings to the same degree, but they're just not massive attention seekers who want to invent a whole new term to describe how different they are?
The same reason we have different terms for things like puddles and lakes. very obviously hold more water and puddles hold less. When one becomes the other isn't very clear, but we still use these concepts without often calling into question why a body of water with, let's say, 1,000 liters is a lake and a body of water with 10 liters is a big puddle. The same.
Okay, so basically my objection there, as I said, well, considering we know that everybody has complicated feelings about their gender to some degree, why is it that we have a certain point at which we start saying that you are now a specific thing, you are trans, when we would not say that about other people? And he's saying, well, there are plenty of instances where we have one word for one thing and a different word for a different thing, and the only thing separating them is a matter of degrees, and there's no clear point where one thing becomes the other. Now, my response to that is not necessarily a knockdown response, but I think it's relevant that in one situation we're talking about something that can be objectively and clearly observed, which I think takes some of the arbitrariness or the sting of the arbitrariness out of things. So in the case of a lake and a puddle, everybody can look at a puddle and they can look at a lake and they can see that there is a clear difference in the amount of water there, and everyone can agree on that. In the case of people's personalities and their internal sense of self, that's something that is going to be much harder to pin down and say, oh yeah, well clearly this person has it more than this other person. So while yes, I can recognize that there are examples where there is actually a benefit to saying, well, yeah, this person has crossed a line to actually being a specific thing. When you're talking about something so nebulous, having a line that somebody crosses around something like that, where it's already quite difficult to know what you're talking about, I think just exacerbates the issue.
Same way, since gender identity is related to how you want to be treated, having less situations where you want to be treated a certain way is going
fewer.
If she doesn't want to be treated like someone who's supposed to be submissive, or knows less, or has less skills related to something than a man, that's all.
Fewer.
And if they don't want to be referred to by she, her pronouns, then gender critical people would say there's something wrong with them, or they shouldn't be treated in the way they want to be. If they want to change their body to make them...
Okay, so that's his argument. Basically, it's hypocritical to say that a woman can be masculine and perform a masculine role, but can't therefore be called by male pronouns. Well, the issue is, that would, in my view, make them no longer a woman. Or rather, it would mean they're claiming to no longer be a woman, which would actually undercut the significance of them being gender non-conforming. So, women being all sorts of different types of masculine is very valid and kind of liberating as far as getting away from gender stereotypes. But then if that same woman decides she wants to now be considered a man, that's at that point reinforcing gender stereotypes. This is an issue I pointed out before, which is people will take the idea of there being lots of diversity and they'll think, well, if you just added more diversity, surely that would be being consistent. But the issue is there's a point at which you've added so much diversity that you've meant that the word or whatever category you're saying is diverse no longer means anything, so it being diverse doesn't mean anything. The analogy I've given before is that there are all sorts of different types of atheists. You know, atheists can be tall or short, they can be skinny or fat, they can be fans of Lord of the Rings or fans of Star Wars. You know, like, I could obviously go on because there's so many different things that could be true about them. But to then say, so let's just add a tiny little bit to that diversity and say that an atheist can also include somebody who believes in God. Well, then, first of all, you've made the word atheist no longer mean anything. Of course, that also means that the diversity is no longer impressive. There's nothing, and I don't, when I say impressive, I suppose I should say, I don't necessarily think it's always impressive. When I say, I mean it leaves an impression. I don't mean it's like necessarily creditable, but just something where you're like, oh yeah, there's a lot of diversity. But how can you be impressed by that if you're dealing with a word that literally means anything? At that point, obviously it's diverse. So that's the issue. To say women can do X, Y, Z thing and all sorts of different things, and there's a lot of diversity to being a woman, that is significant. It's like, oh, look, you know, women can do all sorts of things. And of course, for a young girl who's going to grow up to be a woman, knowing that women can be all sorts of different things is significant. The problem is if you then say that women can also be biologically male, then at that point, what even is it about being a woman? Like, what does being a woman mean such that the diversity of options available to women means anything? Nothing.
Are gendered nouns, and pronouns like he, him are gendered pronouns, not sexed pronouns. What we call people outside of medical situations where somebody's sex that they were born with must be known should be unrelated to it.
Okay, so I don't know if an argument's going to be given for that, but yeah, the claim there is, well, pronouns are actually gendered pronouns. And to be fair, we do often use the phrase gendered pronouns. I think the term gender, I've said this before, but I'll say it again, and I'll say it many times in the future, I'm sure. Gender is a term that's used quite confusingly nowadays because it's sometimes used to mean gender roles, gender stereotypes, gender expectations, and it's sometimes used to describe the categories of man and woman themselves. Like someone might say, what is your gender? Is your gender man or woman? So that creates a lot of confusion and a lot of potential for equivocation. I don't think we should use the phrase gendered pronouns for that reason, but even then, I admit it's something I frequently naturally want to say because, obviously I speak the English language and I recognize how in English the term gender has become confused. But I don't think you can just say because the word is used this way, therefore these are gendered pronouns. I especially don't think you can say that therefore the pronouns need to be understood as directly associated with gender expression, gender identity, gender roles, gender stereotypes. Rather, I think we should recognize that gender is a term that is now used frequently when what people actually mean is biological sex, and therefore, if we're being consistent, we should call them sex pronouns. And he's saying, well, aside from in very specific biological or like medical situations, we don't use sexed categories to refer to people. Quite simply, we do. Most people assume whether somebody's a man or woman based on their biological sex, and a lot of the time, unless a trans-identified male or trans-identified female is very convincing, most people will still continue to think of them as a man if they're biologically male and a woman if they're biologically female. The cases where we see someone and we literally can't tell, or even we recognize sufficiently that they are embodying femininity such that we might call a biological male a woman or by female pronouns based on that, these are going to be very rare situations. I don't think you can say, well, obviously we always use pronouns to refer to people's gender and not sex, because most of the time we use it to refer to people's sex, not gender.
If I said that the word salt doesn't mean anything, and then someone pointed out that it means a white crystalline substance that gives seawater its characteristic taste and is used for seasoning or preserving food, then I could say that words like seasoning, in isolation, don't mean very much to me at all. If I don't know what seasoning means, obviously I don't know what salt means. It doesn't get rid of the fact that salt does mean something. King Critical knows what I mean by...
Okay, so basically I said the problem with the definition of trans identity is that it's often defined using lots of other terms that aren't clearly defined, and he's saying, well, that's true of all definitions. The issue is, I'm saying, when you're talking about something which is not a well-known concept, which a lot of people don't understand, if you're going to say, well, this term is clearly defined, you need to be, or have a reasonable expectation that people will understand the words with which you're defining this new term. In the case of being transgender, it's mentioning the idea of gender identity. So that is not a good definition because most people don't know what gender identity is. That's what I'm saying. It's like if, you lived in a world where no one had ever heard of socialism, and you defined socialism, and it mentioned worker cooperatives controlling the means of production and the abolition of private property. Lots of those words, in a world where no one's heard of socialism, no one's going to know what any of those terms mean either. So it's pretty obvious in that context you should be more specific about what these words actually mean, basically.
Meaning that gender identity actually has a lot to do with tradition. What's often assumed as how a person will want to be treated will depend on their sex instead of something else, what I would call gender identity, gender critical.
So one of my other criticisms, I said, it's not a tradition that biological males are called men and biological females are called women. He's saying it is to do with tradition, and he kind of just gave his reasoning there. I don't think he's addressing my point. I would say that the definition of words and the way we use language is not tradition. That accurately categorizing things is not tradition. It's basically just a reality of how human beings function and communicate. So I wouldn't call that a tradition. The idea that we call rocks minerals, that's not tradition. The idea that we correctly categorize birds as part of, basically dinosaurs, that's not a tradition. That is, scientists looked at the family, or they kind of put together the tree of life, and they realized the category that birds fall under, so they accurately described them based on that. The decision to no longer categorize Pluto as a planet, that's not a tradition. And you can see where I'm going. I don't think that it is a tradition to say biological males are men. I think that's just an accurate statement about reality using human language.
There's no reason, for example, to think that somebody needs to know your sex in most of your interactions at school or work, or out on the street. Why would we possibly need to know that in that moment? Instead, it's obvious that what should be prioritized is how a given person wants to be treated.
Okay, look, I don't get what you're saying there, because we need to know who people are, and part of that involves knowing basically everything about who someone is. And well, yeah, okay, it's not as if you technically need to know it. I think it's it's basically, for example, I don't need to know what job someone has. I don't need to know that. I mean, well, maybe if I'm employing someone or whatever, or, I need a plumber, I need to know if the person who I call is actually a plumber. But generally speaking, you say, well, I don't need to know what job someone has. But to argue from that, therefore, we don't need to use that word to describe anything is ridiculous. I mean, there's many situations where there are things we do not need to know. In the majority of cases, we arguably don't need to know anything. I don't need to know what fabric these are made out, these clothes are made out of. Many things I don't need to know. Obviously, I could go on. But to say based on that, therefore, basically it's a free-for-all on what anything means, because we don't ever actually need to know anything in the vast majority of cases, is clearly ridiculous. No, yeah. Do I need to know someone's biological sex? No, I don't need to. Especially if I can just know other things about them. Because you might say, well, I'm a woman and I need to know if a man is biologically male because otherwise he might sexually assault me. Well, maybe someone could say, well, what you really need to know is, does the person want to sexually assault you? Is the person inclined to sexually assault you? And that would probably be an even better thing to know. So that's what I imagine Sentient Darkness could say. And, that is a genuine point. But the thing is, even though you don't need to know it, that doesn't mean that it's not something that is worth knowing and worth accurately describing.
Then it doesn't affirm the reality that people with the label of transgender don't have anything in common. They don't need to have a tremendous amount in common as long as they have one thing in common which is encompassed by the definition. To give an analogy,
No, okay, yeah, no, absolutely. I agree they don't have to have anything in common. But the thing is, again, what I'm saying is this. This whole idea of you are trans because you want to be treated the way a typical biological male wants to be treated, or rather, let's say a typical biological female wants to be treated, but then the only thing you mean by that is that a typical biological female wants to be called a woman. You're basically saying, well, I want to be called a woman, but the issue is, well, then how do you define woman? In fact, I think he literally has defined the term woman as somebody who wants to be treated the way a typical biological female wants to be treated. But again, if the only thing he's saying about the way a typical biological female wants to be treated is that they want to be called a woman, then he's basically saying a woman is someone who wants to be called a woman, which is circular. So no, that's the sense in which the definition doesn't mean anything. It's not that it doesn't tell us extra things about the person, and there may be lots of things they don't have in common. It's that I don't even know what the thing is that they do have in common, that they want to be called a woman, but being called a woman doesn't mean anything if the term woman isn't clearly defined.
The fact that words like feminine are nebulous and can mean a variety of different things to different people.
Okay, that's not accurate, or that's not analogous at all. And that's a good example of what I'm not talking about. Yes, the term feminine can be different to different people, but it's clear what it means. And you can say, what does it mean for someone to be feminine? Oh, it means they like to wear a dress, be, like pink, frilly, light, flowery dress, and have blonde hair in curls, and they like to giggle and wear lots of makeup and maybe be a bit coquettish and innocent and whatever else. Obviously, I can say all of that, and I can say that that's being feminine. And the thing is, that is all stuff which is tied up with a lot of kind of offensive stereotypes a lot of the time. Not to say that it's not impossible that some people might do some of that stuff and it wouldn't be something that, you know, it would be offensive to point out they're doing. But if me saying, well, that person's being feminine, that's fine, because there's no expectation that the term feminine needs to be empowering or needs to basically be anything other than something that might be offensive for people to be associated with. However, if I said, what does it mean for somebody to be a woman? And I listed all that stuff off, that would be very offensive. So that's basically the issue. With feminine, no, absolutely, we can say all the things it means, and we don't really have to worry about offending anyone, because people can choose whether or not they want to be feminine. We all know what feminine is, and it's something that some people might not want to basically act out, but they have kind of that choice. With being a woman, we know that being a woman is not something you choose, and it's not something that should be associated with behavior, especially behavior that's tied up with a lot of sexist ideas.
So as long as there are some similarities between people who are labeled as trans under one definition of trans, then when a person tells you they're trans, they are indeed telling you something of substance.
Okay, no, so the only big thing there would be that it would have to be something that basically can be quite easily described, or like when you're told the definition, you can easily describe what's being spoken about using words other than the definition, right? When I said feminine, I was able to describe a whole load of things without using the word feminine. So essentially that's the question. Can you, once you've said this is what trans identity is, and this is what being a woman is under trans identity, can you then describe that without making explicit reference to trans identity?
With my definition, they'd be telling you their mental traits to do with how they want to be treated. I've explained previously how this exactly applies. Okay, well maybe by being of substance he means having a concrete...
Oh wait, no, okay, so he says, he's saying I've explained previously how it's applied. Well, what he explained previously is, well, what I mean is the mental trait of wanting to be called a woman. But that's so obviously circular, so yeah.
They mean that they want to be treated in a different way to what's usually assumed of them based on their sex. This might not mean much to you if you don't know exactly what they're referring to by those words, but you can just ask them. That's the point of language, to be able to communicate, and if you don't understand something, gain a greater understanding by using it. Next, King Critical addresses my...
So there, he really didn't say anything that substantiated his definition at all. Because again, it's an obviously circular definition, and the only way you can make it less circular would be to make it incredibly stereotypical, and that's the issue, to basically make it so it's like, well, you're a woman if you perform certain sex stereotypes, but of course that would be a very objectionable thing to say.
Besides this being very different to the kind of argument he was originally making, that it's okay to criticize trans women who express a fetishistic hyperfeminized form of femininity, instead of that there's no reason that members of the male sex might embody femininity, it also completely ignores my second point, that if the person in question isn't doing hyperfeminine things with the intention of it representing what a woman is, then there's no issue.
So I'll address the first thing. To be honest, with the first thing, while my original point was that basically there's a reason why women would be doing femininity and therefore they have an excuse, there's also in general just the fact of like, you know, everyone knows about the whole kind of idea of black people are allowed to use the N-word, and whether you think that's okay or not, whatever. Basically, it's a pretty commonly established thing. And the basic logic there is, well, this was a word used to kind of put black people down, so black people, they're allowed to decide how they feel about it, and if they don't feel like essentially it doesn't make sense for black people themselves to be constrained by sensitivity around a word that was originally used to put them down, would be the logic. And I think in the exact same sense, one could argue that it doesn't make sense. And again, not everyone would agree with this, and not everyone agrees that it's appropriate for black people to use the N-word, for example. But one could argue more legitimately that it does not make sense to think that women should be constrained by the sensitivity around the concept of being feminine, when that was originally designed to put them down. That basically women do have a right to think of femininity as empowering. And even if you are kind of a more typical rad femme who would think, no, it's really not appropriate for anyone to be doing femininity. Femininity is not something that can be empowering. I'd imagine you'd at least recognize that it is certainly more legitimate for a woman to be trying to kind of retake and reimagine femininity to be empowering than it is for a man to be doing so. So that would be my point. But essentially, it's a really simple point, because again, you just relate it to the idea of cultural appropriation. It is fundamentally different for a woman to be, or a member of a marginalized group to be continuing to, basically perform certain cultural signifiers than it is for a member of a more privileged group to be doing so. And that's the whole point around cultural appropriation. I think it applies here. The second point he said was, well, it's fine if they're not actively trying to claim that them being feminine is part of what makes them a woman. I don't agree with that at all. If I wore an American Indian headdress with like feathers and, basically did some other kind of, basically like wore a Native American costume, then is that not offensive as long as I say, well, I don't think this actually makes me a Native American? Now, again, some people have different opinions about cultural appropriation. I do think sometimes sensitivity can be a bit silly around it. But I think no matter what, again, we can all recognize that what is offensive about cultural appropriation is not the specific claim that performing another country's culture, especially in a kind of over-the-top stereotypical way, that's not offensive because you're claiming that literally makes you a member of that culture or that ethnicity. It's offensive just because, in general, performing that in a really kind of stereotypical way is inappropriate. It's inappropriate, and it's kind of minimalizing a lot of like a lot of cultural baggage tied up with aesthetics that relates to a genuine history of oppression. That's the issue. And yeah, absolutely, I do not think that when you take something like a drag queen performance, I don't think that a drag queen performance is, I would say it's probably made more offensive if a drag queen performer who's performing this ridiculous parody of femininity claims that performing that parody actually makes them a woman. That's even more offensive. But even if they're not doing that, it's still legitimate to be offended by it. And I'll just say on this point again, I'm not saying that people should not be able to be gender non-conforming, just like I'm not saying people shouldn't be able to engage with other cultures. But I do think it's legitimate to talk about this historical baggage that's tied up with this stuff in both cases.
Yet King Critical wants to bring it down a notch and claim that trans women who embody femininity are being demeaning to cis women. Then do cis men who just want to look and act feminine also being demeaning to women?
Well, again, I kind of already addressed that because I said, so a drag queen performer who does not claim to be a woman would be an example of somebody who performs femininity but does not claim it makes them a woman. And the answer is, again, are they demeaning to women in doing that? Sort of. Again, it's not really my place to say exactly how offensive it is for somebody to embody femininity in that way. What I can say, though, is that it's perfectly legitimate for women to at least personally feel that there's something wrong with that, or at least for women to criticize that and turn a kind of analytical lens to that in terms of what it could say about the wider socio-political context around the way that men treat womanhood, the way that men treat femininity. I don't think that that's as much of a challenge as this guy thinks it is.
This is clearly absurd and sexist. There's no reason why
No, it's not absurd or sexist.
a member of the male sex should be able to express themselves in a feminine way.
Yeah, of course there is. See, again, just use the transracial analogy. Basically, it would be like saying there's no reason why a white person shouldn't be allowed to present themselves with whatever kind of cultural signifiers they like. And the answer is, well, again, I'm not saying categorically it's wrong, but I am saying we can at least recognize that there is a lot of cultural baggage there that this guy is refusing to recognize. And I think that is, frankly, sad, because I think it's worth talking about the reality of this cultural baggage. Anyway, we'll see if he elaborates.
Why a member of the female sex shouldn't be able to express themselves in a masculine way. Evidently, the issue only comes if they assume that all being a man or a woman is being masculine or feminine.
No, again, that's not really the only point where the issue comes. I already kind of addressed that. Yeah, like basically it doesn't, like while that would make it worse, that's not the only issue. It's not the only possible issue, certainly.
On top of this, he's just assuming that the only reason a cis woman would decide to look in a fetishistic hyper-feminine way is because it's expected of her, and because of the stereotypes pushed on her.
Yeah, okay, see, this is the thing. I shouldn't have said that, because like I say, there are actually women who choose to dress or look in a feminine way because they want to retake femininity. They think that being feminine can be empowering, things like that, which I've already addressed. So yeah, it was wrong of me to suggest the only reason why a woman could choose to dress in a feminine way is because it's expected of them, although I don't think I really said that. But yeah, all I said was I think that's a reason why we could imagine that would be the case with women, where it wouldn't be the case with men.
Really king critical? Are there no cis women who want to look that way just because they like the aesthetic or feel more comfortable being hyper feminine?
Yeah, okay, see, I've already kind of addressed that, so yeah, there we go.
That seems like a truth claim you won't be able to back up at all. The same, of course, can be the case of trans women. They can just want to look in a hyper-feminine way because they enjoy being hyper-feminine. And for that reason alone, you can't just assume that most trans women, or even that a lot of trans women, are being demeaning when they look and behave in hyper-feminine ways.
So yeah, I suppose I spoke about the idea that women might, dress in a feminine way because they think it's empowering. The one thing I didn't mention, of course, is the possibility that a woman might dress a certain way because she just wants to. And within that context, of course, that's another thing. Like, absolutely, there's no reason why a woman might not just like the colour pink. And certainly there are men who might also like the colour pink. So that's another aspect, but it's an aspect I've already kind of mentioned with the point about like cultural appropriation, basically. Absolutely. I mean, look, I like curry, right? Obviously, it's perfectly okay, and that's not that I like curry has nothing to do with my kind of socio-cultural feelings towards India. That's irrelevant. It's that I just like the flavor. Or an even better example would be like, I really like Mexican food. And as you probably are aware, Mexico doesn't really have much of a socio-cultural influence in the UK. It's not like how it is in America. So that I really like Mexican food, like burritos, fajitas, things like that, is just a reflection of the fact I enjoy the food. There is no sense in which anyone could think I'm possibly trying to culturally appropriate any aspect of being Mexican. So clearly that is possible, but that doesn't mean there aren't socio-cultural ideas to consider, is basically what I would say. So I would not deny that there can be certainly men who feel a particular enthusiasm for the idea of performing femininity, just as there are women who might feel that, again, not even because of it being femininity, but just because they like the colour pink, which someone might like, or, they like the visual aesthetic of dresses. But what I am saying is it's very naive, almost on the level of kind of like colourblind racism, to act as if there is not a socio-cultural dimension to this.
When it is both the case that gender stereotypes can be pushed on both cis women and trans women in the present, even if trans women didn't experience it in early childhood, and that some trans women may have been brought up with the same gender stereotypes as some cis women.
So there his argument was that basically not only women might experience femininity as degrading, but trans-identified males might as well too. That is, I would say, very generous to trans-identified males. It's a bit like people who think it's okay for gay men to say the B word, which of course is quite offensive to a lot of women, as if like, because they are in some way often kind of associated with femininity, or certainly not typical masculinity, therefore they're allowed to use that word, which I think is not okay. And of course, there's women who use the F slur to refer to gay men, and that's also an issue. And I think this idea that people can just say, well, because I do have my own baggage with these concepts in my way. And I'm sure I can imagine a lot of trans-identified males, a lot of cross-dressing males will have some baggage around the concept of femininity. I don't think that's enough to say, well, therefore, I can basically do all this femininity stuff, and I have the right to do that, basically. I'd also say, especially since, because I was thinking again about the cultural appropriation analogy, and I was thinking about what if like a white person grew up in a really black area and had a lot of experience with black people? Would that justify them appropriating black culture? And I thought, well, it probably would, actually. But the difference there is that's probably something that is a very authentic experience to them, that is not something they chose. Whereas a trans-identified male, that's something they chose. So, it would almost be more like, so for example, I'm thinking like if you have a white person who was born in, Louisiana in like a very black neighborhood, kind of a quite typical black experience, all their friends were black, and or someone like Eminem, for example, is Eminem in fact actually the rap's a really good example, because what do you have in rap when it comes to the idea of white rappers? You have Eminem, who generally people give a lot of credit to, because Eminem grew up around black people. He grew up a very kind of typical, insofar as like being black is a subculture in the US, or even if you're like a more specifically kind of Midwestern black experience, he had a lot of that experience. He was immersed in that culture, and not because he chose to, not because he came into it out of curiosity, or because he felt that in some way it was almost like his right to, or almost like a colonizer to go in there. No, it was something he was born into, an experience that he completely organically fell into, and therefore, as a white rapper, rap is a very kind of black thing to do. Lots of people put respect on him for that. Conversely, what you're now getting with a lot of white rappers is people, a bit more like me, who are middle class white dudes who listen to rap, who like rap, very much chose to listen to it, and now because of that, we have an association with that culture, but very much from the perspective of an outside person choosing to get involved with it. And within that context, considering we're choosing to get involved with it, I don't know if you can then say, oh, we have a right to claim that culture as our own. Like some white middle class dude who listened to a load of Tupac or whatever has a right to say, well, I really just connect on a deep level to black culture. I don't think that's particularly credible. And that's, of course, very analogous to what a lot of trans-identified males are doing. They're not people who were immersed in the experience of being a woman just because of the way they grew up and kind of having a unique experience in terms of how they grew up. No, far more likely they are people who were raised to be men and chose to immerse themselves in women's culture, and having chosen that, having said, basically use their agency to decide that's something they're going to get into, is it then appropriate for them to claim the signifiers of that identity as if it is an identity that they, had a completely organic experience with? I don't think it is.
I didn't know I needed to hear King Critical say sissy hypno porn before, but now I do. This is a joke. Autogynephilia has been debunked again and again, so his pathetic attempt at making it seem absurd that people don't believe in it does nothing but affirm that he knows very little science on this topic. Of course.
Okay, so I would just like to point out, I'm not going to play everything I just said there, but I actually think I made a really good point. Basically, what I said was, so essentially, he tried to do the whole autogynephilia doesn't exist, but to the extent it does, women have autogynephilia too. And I pointed out two obvious things. One, I pointed out that, of course, autogynephilia exists because, and I've said this before, this is my classic knockdown argument for the existence of autogynephilia. We know that there are a huge number of men, well, a huge number of men relatively speaking, a huge number of men who do fetishize the idea of being perceived as a woman. Sissy, porn, that kind of content exists. You can find it. You can find it if you're on 4chan for 5 seconds. You'll find like some post about like, imagine you're this woman or whatever. So that content exists. And we also know there are biological males who claim to be women. It is absolutely absurd to claim simultaneously that there are biological males who really get off sexually on the idea of being perceived as women, and there are biological males who claim to be women, but that these two groups have nothing to do with each other. Now, the next thing I pointed out was in response to sorry, my voice probably sounds different now because I got a little bit of a cough thing going on. The next thing I pointed out was that as far as like the idea that women have this too, I said, well, considering we have all the audio-visual evidence for this fetish amongst men, where is the audio-visual evidence? Where is the evidence in general for this fetish amongst women? It doesn't exist. Like, that's the thing. You can find anywhere within 5 seconds. I could go onto, I'd go onto my incognito mode on Google, and I could find evidence of this autogynephilia fetish amongst men. I could not find that same thing, anything like as quickly with women. I wouldn't even know where to look. Like, where is it? What is this fetish? As far as we can tell, it doesn't exist. So that's the big difference, and he doesn't seem to have a response to it.
Which leads to them being seen as less than human and treated with less empathy, and how many other groups of the LGBTQ+ community have been characterized as hypersexual and therefore posing a threat to society. I recommend Julia Serrano's Autogynephilia as
Okay, so I'm just gonna say what you said there was a whole thing about like how basically viewing trans-identified males as having autogynephilia and it being a fetish is just like how women and members of the LGB community have been attacked for being like sick perverts in the past. Here's the thing. Let's be honest. Straight men are attacked for being sick perverts. But let's just get out of the way. Lots of people, like, who is it who is mostly thought of as being the types that watch porn? It's straight men, right? And there's lots of people think straight men are sick perverts. So the idea of saying, well, you're saying trans-identified males are sick perverts, therefore you're as good as saying that they're women and that they in fact do, but basically LGB with the T, because LGBs are called sick perverts, and you're saying trans people are sick perverts too. But yeah, you're also, women were called sick perverts because of slut shaming. That's ridiculous. No, people aren't saying women are sick perverts for slut shaming, but lots of people would say that straight men are sick perverts. So actually, thinking that trans-identified males are, basically that, is completely consistent with thinking that they are men. So this idea of that in some way, if you're basically making this autogynephilia criticism, you are as good as treating trans-identified males as women is very ridiculous when you think about it for a second.
The fact that some men have female or feminine embodiment fantasies isn't an indication that any trans women also have them. But even if it was found to be the case that there's porn made for trans women, which trans women watch, which is...
Okay, so he just unironically said, the fact that there exists pornography that exists specifically about the fantasy of a biological male becoming a woman, he's saying, is not evidence that that pornography is made for or enjoyed by trans-identified males. And I'm sorry, but if you think that is absolutely insane to suggest. That is insane to suggest that there exists porn that's literally like, hey man, hey biological male, wouldn't it be so hot if you were a woman? Wouldn't that be so sexy if you were a woman? To say that is not at all made for, or does not at all appeal for, and basically has nothing to do with actual biological males who claim to be a woman, is insane. I just don't know what to do. It's absurd to say there is literally something that's all about how hot and awesome this thing would be, and it's consumed by biological males, and there are also biological males who are doing that thing. And to say those two things, there's no evidence those two things have anything to do with each other. Well, you don't need evidence because it's obvious common sense those two things are related.
There's no reason to even grant that the majority of the views on that kind of porn comes from trans women, or that any significant amount of trans women view it. And even if they...
Okay, so there he says, well, there's no reason to think that... So he said two things there. One, he said there's no reason to think the majority of views come from trans women. Well, maybe not, because so-called trans women are very rare. But then he says that a significant amount of views come from them. And it's like, I'm sorry, again, it's insane. It's just insane to be like, yeah, sure, there's porn that's literally about like a biological male becoming a woman, but there's no reason to think that that is actually being viewed by a significant number of biological males who actually claim to be women. It is such obvious common sense that those two things are related to each other. I can't believe anyone would ever claim otherwise.
Going a little bit beyond what's typical of your average biological male, and it can immediately give you a reason to suspect maybe this is autogynephilia.
Way to show your true colours here, King Critical. If you're going to be a transphobe, at least don't also throw a lot of gay men under the bus at the same time. It's no secret that there are plenty of gay men, and
okay, so what I said there, and he thinks that was like me showing my true colours. Basically, all I said there was that there is a fetish amongst some women of being hyper feminine. I do think that's true. I think there are women, and what I called it was the bimbo fetish. You can call it whatever, but basically, yeah, a fetish of being hyper feminine amongst women and often hypersexualized. That does exist. But what I said is, well, since in general women are expected to wear makeup, just because a woman's wearing makeup, that's not an immediate reason to think she has this fetish, whereas because it's much rarer for biological males to wear makeup, if a biological male is wearing makeup, there's much more reason to think that could be because they're autogynephilic. Again, that is just it's just common sense. It's just how statistics work.
it's like assuming that whoever wears a belt is into BDSM. What a gross and incompetent argument. I do have to point out,
No, because the point is, again, wearing a belt is very common, right? If you live in a world where very few people wear a belt, maybe it would be reasonable to think anyone who wears a belt must be into BDSM. Yeah, that's not really a comparison. Anyway, you know what? I think I think I'm gonna have to end here because we've reached the end of the amount of time I should be recording for. I know that we're technically 5 minutes behind where we should be, because we should have finished at 201. I'm really hoping there will be like some kind of outro such that it will, like, the end will feel fun. I think no matter what, I'm going to finish this video in the next part. I technically have like 30 minutes to get through next time. I might just record longer, especially considering that I'm not